Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. It is time for your weekly Psych, Culture, and Society lecture. This week we are focusing on the self and personality, so let's just jump right into it. The overarching themes in this chapter is that there are aspects of self-concepts that are universal and others that are culturally variable. Such differences have important implications for our social interactions and perceptions of them. Something as basic as, quote, how we view ourselves differs greatly across cultures. And where I like to begin this chapter typically is the Who I Am test, also known as the 20 Statements test. A study of Kenyans and American undergraduate students were conducted by researchers. Kenyan participants were divided into groups that could theoretically vary in terms of how much they were exposed to Western cultural ways. Kenyan University students in Nairobi should be the most westernized group in their sample. The educational system was shaped by the British colonial past. Employed adults in Nairobi may be slightly less westernized than their Kenyan student peers. While traditional indigenous Kenyan groups such as the Samburu and the Maasai will be the least westernized. Most frequent self-descriptions for the Americans were personal characteristics such as their traits, attitudes, and abilities, and 48% of their statements. Similar statements made up less than 2% of the Maasai and Samburu self-descriptions. Their responses generally reflected their social identity. Their roles and memberships accounted for more than 60% of their statements, made up only 7% of American self-descriptions. So kind of the idea here is that you're just kind of giving a piece of paper with some lines on it, and what's in front of it. So in front of each one of the lines, you just have text that reads "I am" in English, or in this case Swahili equivalent of "I am," and then you just fill out who you are. And researchers examined this, as I stated, and they found that among the American participants, their self-descriptions were about 50% of them, a little under 48%, were related to personal characteristics such as their traits, attitudes, and abilities. Now, you should take note, though, that Americans do sometimes consider their social roles, and the Maasai sometimes consider their personality traits. These trends appear to be associated with greater exposure to Western cultures, and also simultaneously with greater industrialization. So again, it's kind of like not this like dichotomy, but rather cultures varying in the levels in which and how individuals describe themselves. And continuing on with that study, as I stated, Americans do sometimes think of themselves in terms of social identity, and Maasai and Samburu sometimes consider their own personality traits. The degree to which people from these cultures consider these different aspects of themselves varies considerably. The other two Kenyan groups fell in between, with the university students being closer to the American pattern and the workers more closely resembling the Maasai and Samburu patterns. So we kind of see a distribution where the traditional and indigenous tribes in Kenya defining themselves in more social roles and memberships in the I am test, while Kenyans who are closer to Western culture, that is Kenyan University students, describing themselves in more similar ways to American university students than their Kenyan worker peers or the traditional indigenous tribes of Kenya. So you kind of see the degree to which you're exposed to Western culture influencing how and the degree to which an individual describes themselves on this Who I Am test. And if you were wondering, yes, that was me in what year is that? 2007, I believe, in Kenya with my Maasai friends. Researchers have suggested the existence of a fundamental difference in how the self is subjectively organized. There's the independent self and the interdependent self. Marcus and Kitayama argue that this difference is based on people having either an independent view of self or an interdependent view of self. Beginning with the independent self, It derives important aspects of identity from one's personal characteristics or inner attributes. Identity is distinct from one's relationships. In this figure, the circle around the individual does not overlap with the other circles. Important aspects of identity are one's personal characteristics, the X's inside circles are aspects of identity, and the larger ones are more important for self-identity. These inner attributes include preferences, opinions, traits, and so on. The self is stable and consistent across different situations and throughout the lifespan, and the border around the individual circle is solid, representing the stability. The individual does not change much from situation to situation. Self-attributes are also unique. The self is perceived as self-contained, arising from the individual and not from interactions with other people. It's viewed as a coherent entity, and individuals feel the need to publicly present themselves as consistent with these attributes. Considerable fluidity exists between in-groups and out-groups. New relationships are easily formed, and old relationships are easily dissolved. This view is characteristic of more Western cultures, such as Americans, as in the study comparing Americans and Kenyans. So kind of the idea here, just kind of a quick recap. As stated, this is kind of like the traditional view of personality, of self, in the West, and how we kind of understand ourselves to be. We kind of have these inner self attributes that are consistent, that are stable, that are present across all circumstances and across kind of all time throughout your life. The idea is that those attributes are coherent and they're stable, as I stated, and you can kind of see that in the schematic with much more with a solid line around this individual. And also a key difference is that because your self is kind of like stable, and it's an independent view of self. You're not defined by other people. And as stated, your attributes are unique and stable. That allows for kind of considerable fluidity, as I stated, between in-groups and out-groups, because those relationships really don't or aren't viewed as really impacting who you are as a person, like on a fundamental level. So kind of there's like less at stake, right? So more people can enter your in-group and then leave your out-group, and it's not the end of the world because you just have less. Yourself is less tied to individuals within your in-group compared to the interdependent self, which is a relational entity which fundamentally connected to important relationships. The identity is interdependent with others and one's relationships. The overlap of one's own circle with one's relationships suggests that relationships with others are an important part of self-identity. The roles, relationships, and memberships constitute important aspects of the self. Bold X's lie at the intersection between individuals and significant relationships. Identity changes across situations as roles change. The self is not bounded or separate from others in the surrounding context. The dotted line around the individual circle indicates that the self is not a bounded entity, but rather is influenced by relationships. A clear distinction exists between in-groups and out-groups. Strong loyalty and commitment to the in-group, but little willingness to cooperate and form with out-group members. And there's a solid boundary between in-group and out-group suggests that it is not easy for an out-group members to become in-group members, and in-group members do not easily fall into the out-group category. And this is characteristic of much of the non-Western world, including the indigenous Kenyans that we discussed, and to a lower level, but still more than American university students, workers in Nairobi. So kind of a quick little rundown of what we went through here is you see, and you can see this illustrated in the figure, the self does not have that solid line anymore. It's dotted. And it's dotted to visually represent how the self is not bounded or separate from others in the interdependent view of self. That is, the self is not this stable entity that exists free from anybody else, but rather the roles, the relationships, and the memberships that we belong to define ourselves. And thus, the self is connected to other important relationships within our in-group. And because we put or individuals within the interdependent view of self theory, put so much emphasis on their self within and define themselves so heavily based on the roles and memberships that they belong to, the in group becomes a much more kind of important factor in determining the self. Thus, the fluidity between in group and out group is much more rigid, or is less fluid. It's kind of a, and visually here in our little schematic, a solid line versus kind of the dashed line, representing the fact that it's much more difficult to enter the in group of an individual with an interdependent view of self. Again, kind of because it's your existence, yourself, how you act and interact with the world is so dependent, is much more dependent, I should say, on the relationships you have with other individuals within your in-group. Evidence from neurostudies, and that is neuroimaging studies, provides evidence for the existence between the distinction between the independent and interdependent view of self. When participants were asked to use a list of adjectives to evaluate themselves and their mothers, Westerners showed different regions of activation, and Chinese showed activation in the same regions linked to self-representations. So kind of the idea here is that you show two groups with different cultures with traditional differences in the view of self, one independent and one interdependent, and then you measure neurological activity when presenting a photo of themselves and when showing a photo of their mother, or you can ask individuals to describe themselves and then also describe their mother, and then just kind of compare neurological activation patterns between those two prompts, that is the mother or themselves, and then you can compare them across groups, that is American students and Chinese students, and studies neuroimaging studies found differences in brain activation within groups that have independent views of the self. That is, if an American college student was asked to describe themselves and then asked to describe their mother, there would be different neurological patterns. Wherein Chinese university students, for example, when asked to describe themselves and then describe their mother, they would have much more similar neurological patterns. Again, kind of suggesting that the self is related to other and is defined by other important social relationships within that particular individual and at the group level within their in-group. In-group and out-group relationships. Closer relationships are essential in all cultures, but they are especially important for the ways in which people define the self and interdependent as opposed to independent cultures. So kind of just kind of stating the obvious here, that social relationships are important in all cultures. Humans are, quote unquote, an ultra social species, but the extent to which closer relationships are implicated in defining the self varies across culture. For the interdependent self, their in-group and out-group relationships, their distinctions are crucial determining to whom people have obligations. It is difficult to get into a person's in-group. It is rare for in-group members to lose status or fall into the out-group, and in-group, out-group boundaries are stable. So kind of what we already talked about is that because the in-group members of an in-group are so influential in your lives, it's A, tough to get into the in-group, and B, it's difficult to fall out of the out-group because one, it's kind of difficult to get into a different in-group, and also just kind of the time and investment that a culture places into their in-group, and as representative and the extent to which it in-group members impact the interdependent self, it would be kind of like a waste of social resources, of just resources period, to kind of just allow something to be so influential, but at the same time allow individuals within a group to just kind of drift away very easily. Those strong social ties serve social purposes, and survival purposes as well. For the independent self, relationships can be formed and dissolved relatively more easily, with less impact on self-identity. People are more willing to form new social connections and maintain larger networks. They're also less distressed when relationships fade over time. The in-group out-group boundary is more fluid and permeable. So kind of the idea here is that because the self is more stable, it's consistent across time regardless of relationships, individuals are able to form larger social networks because it's less impactful than individuals who have an interdependent sense of self. It's obviously still impactful. We all understand that your friendships and your family members have an impact on your social development and your mood, etc. But the extent that but the degree to which relationships defined your how you define the self, as evident in the Who I Am test, differs, and specifically for the independent self, those social relationships are typically less self-described as a fundamental aspect of who I am on the Who I Am test in independent self cultures. And just to provide a little more specifics and what evidence we have, is that Asian Americans are more accurate than white Americans at identifying the emotions of close friends, while white Americans are more accurate than Asian Americans at recognizing the emotions of strangers. Americans have higher levels of general trust towards strangers than Japanese individuals do. So kind of just the idea here is that because Asian Americans have a higher level interdependent view of self, they are in, thus these social memberships, these roles impact their self at higher rates than independent self cultures. It's kind of more, it's arguably more important to understand the emotional states of your close friends because, your relationship with that individual is much more critical to your own sense of self as opposed to an independent sense of self. And because of that, you have kind of strengths and weaknesses, where on the one hand, it's more important to understand the emotions of close relationships, but you may be less able to recognize the emotions of strangers, just because your sense of self is more impacted by individuals within your in-group, and that, going back to that schematic, that bold line, kind of boundary that represents a distinction between your in-group and out-group members versus independent, a culture with an independent sense of self, wherein that boundary between the in-group and out-group is much more fluid, and because of that, partially, independent sense of self cultures tend to have larger social networks. So therefore, you're communicating with all kinds of different individuals in your in-group, in your out-group, and thus you kind of have more experience interacting with out-group members, and thus may be able to have that experience lending you to have a higher ability to recognize emotions within strangers, aka with members of an out-group. The independent and interdependent view of the self tends to emerge in individualist and collectivist cultures, respectively. Individualist cultures encourage thoughts and behaviors fostering independent self-concepts, and they value distinctiveness from others and being self-sufficient. Collectivist cultures encourage thoughts and behaviors fostering interdependent self-concepts, and they value close relationships and group memberships. So kind of straightforward, embedded within this independent versus interdependent. It's very similar words, individualistic, so being independent, and collectivist being interdependent. So because individualist cultures emphasize distinctness, being self-sufficient, you are It's very similar to the idea that your self is stable, consistent, and unaffected by others, versus a collectivist culture, which encourages thoughts and behaviors, fostering interdependent self-concepts, and they value those group memberships. Because group memberships are so valued within that culture, individuals in that culture are going to have higher rates of interdependent self, because, as we've talked about, in the interdependent sense of self, close relationships within your in-group, those group memberships, those interactions among people within your in-group has such a fundamental influence on an individual. And that fluidity that exists within an individual kind of allows and increases kind of collectivist behaviors, because you're tied to larger social groups rather than that distinct sense of self, seeking to be distinct from others at all times. Where are the individualistic and collectivist cultures found in the world? A survey of 117,000 IBM employees in 40 countries found that individualism is highest in the United States, followed by other English-speaking countries and Western European nations. Collectivism is especially prevalent in Asia and Latin America, but also seen in Africa, Eastern and Southern Europe, and the South Pacific. Worldwide, collectivist cultures are more common, making up more than 80% of the world population. So kind of just tying in what we talked about the first week of class, is that the overwhelming majority of research occurs in individualist cultures, even though worldwide about 80% of the world population lives in collectivist cultures. Next, let's look at some regional differences within the United States, because living in the United States, it's pretty clear, and the real world experiences, that there are regional differences in individualism, collectivism, and how individuals define themselves. So within the United States, Hawaii and the Confederate South score highest in collectivism. The Mountain West and Great Plains states, the Northeast and the Midwest are the least collectivist regions within the United States, and within country differences are also found in other countries such as Japan. So it's important to understand that there's just not a monolithic individualist and collectivist score that applies across all individuals within a given country. And it's also important to note that the levels of individualism and collectivism, respectively, changes throughout history. And in the United States, you can see that there are different clusters of individualism and collectivism. And kind of this is a kind of a factor analysis and looking at particular clusters, and then describing, giving a little label to each of the clusters to describe the characteristics of the traits associated with individuals on average within those particular geographical regions within the United States. Individual and collectivist variation among classes. In Iceland, higher class predicts higher individualism and lower class predicts higher collectivism. Middle-class American parents emphasize the importance of teaching children self-direction, whereas lower-class American parents emphasize conforming to authority figures. In Japan, however, higher class is associated with greater independence, suggests that the higher class may be associated with whatever is the dominant set of cultural values. So kind of just talking about Iceland real quickly, the higher class you are, the more individualistic you are, and in the United States with kind of similar ideas with middle-class parents having placing greater emphasis on self-direction, whereas lower class placing more emphasis on conformity to authority figures. And there may be a lot of cultural reasons why that is. If you're in the lower class, you'll probably have a more precarious job. You'll have less wealth. You'll have just more instability in your life. So therefore, kind of rocking the boat, seeking your own self-direction could be understood by a particular parent or community as maladaptive, because if you're rocking the boat too much or seeking your own self-direction, you're putting yourself at risk for getting fired and thus losing what limited income you have, and you don't have any wealth to fall back on, and if you don't have income coming in, and B, kind of the idea being that if you set expectations too high, emphasize self-direction too much, an individual may make themselves prone to kind of failure, disappointment, and kind of just wasting time, your resources on something that's not achievable. But as stated in the third bullet point, in Japan, higher class is associated with greater interdependent. So it could be that whatever culture, whatever values that a culture values the most, the dominant set of cultural values, the higher you are in class, the more likely you are to reflect those values. And that could be for a whole host of reasons, such as individuals within higher class generally kind of set the cultural restraints in which individuals interact with. Because it may those values may intersect with whatever their particular interests are within a particular country/culture. So it's just some notes on diversity of American individuals/cultures, and I've covered this throughout the lecture, but kind of just a nice little checkpoint here is that the interdependent and independent self-concepts are not meant to be a dichotomy, but rather a continuum. The same dynamic applies to a given culture as well. While Americans are generally individualistic, some are collectivistic, and some are more or less individualistic than others. The individualism to collectivism scale are endpoints of a continuum. Note that these cultural and individual differences really involve average differences. Cultural findings reflect general patterns or average group differences. There is often a range of possible behaviors and exceptions to the norm. X culture is individualistic means that people in X culture, on average, are exposed to more cultural messages encouraging independent thoughts and behaviors than interdependent thoughts and behaviors. So kind of just as I said before, that these are average statistics, and there are considerable variability, especially in a place in the United States, where there are various immigrants who are permanent residents or who have temporary work visas, for example. So individuals within the United States having a large spectrum of individualistic and collectivist, I should say, values. And to kind of the numbers, the way we talk about things are group averages, which you should remember from our bar graph discussion. The difference between group averages and kind of individual responses. So the idea here is it's not a dichotomy, but rather cultures and individuals fall on this, somewhere on this individualistic and collectivist scale. It's a continuum. Culture and gender. Some people may think that the interdependent self-concepts seem more characteristic of women, and independent self-concepts seem more characteristic of men. Researchers examined people of different cultures and genders and whether they differed on collectivism, agency, assertiveness, and relatedness. There were significant cultural differences. Independence, as measured by assertiveness and agency, and interdependence, as measured by collectivism and relatedness, are different in different cultures. There were few cultural gender differences. The only reliable gender difference was relatedness, with Americans scoring higher than men. No gender differences were found for collectivism, agency, and assertiveness. So we're about to get into more specifics of this study, but the idea here is that we have these measures of independence and collectivism, or I should say interdependent senses of selves and independent sense of selves. And within kind of those broad categories, we have individual measures, those being assertiveness, agency, and collectivism and relatedness. And then we're looking at how across cultures, we're evaluating gender differences across cultures. And what researchers found, there are significant differences, but also differences in just kind of how an individual will even define certain actions. That is, are they representative of assertiveness or less assertiveness? And kind of continuing on with that point, cultures around the world have different views on gender equality, on whether roles, obligations, and rights of men should be different. High gender egalitarianism is women should be treated the same as men. It's defined as that. And low gender egalitarianism is defined as men should be granted more rights, privileges, and power than women. Within a given culture, men and women tend to share fairly similar views about gender equality. In other words, in cultures in which men hold gender egalitarian values, women also hold the same values. In most cases, men had more traditional gender roles than women. It could be due to men benefiting more from traditional views than women. So, as I was stated before in the previous slide, there's differences in how different cultures kind of define equality. And as we just reviewed here, we have high gender egalitarianism and low gender egalitarianism. And men and women actually across cultures, tend to share similar views about gender equality. So if you can look on the figure on your right, the table on your right, you can see these scores are very close to each other. And they cluster by country. But in general, we see men having more traditional gender role beliefs than women. So we see that across cultures, men and women views of gender views are quite similar across cultures, or within a culture, I should say. But men tend to have a slightly higher ratings of traditional gender views than women, and that could be related to kind of historical, especially in the West. It's difficult to say across, non-industrialized countries, but especially in Western context and many countries that we generally talk about, the men have traditionally benefited from the gender roles within their society through increased wealth, for example, and kind of higher levels of rights within a given country. The same study included other variables to test the relationships with gender equality. The results showed that some predictors of higher gender egalitarianism were religion, geographical location, and urbanization. And of course, it's important to note that these findings are correlational, not causal. So although there are particular correlations with views on gender egalitarianism within a particular country, it's just a correlation. And why exactly and what particular factors are implicated in causing the particular state of gender egalitarianism within a particular culture, it's really difficult to entangle because every country obviously has, or at least every geographical region has hundreds to thousands of years of history to it, and different variation within particular religions and technological advances, and just a wide variety, I should say, of differences on psychological constructs, which are going to contribute to, in this case here, views on gender egalitarianism. So although this study found correlations, it's important to note that these correlations don't act as some deterministic factor, wherein any individual who belongs to a particular religion or within a particular geographical location or has more or less urbanization is not deterministic of a culture's views on gender egalitarianism. Economist Esther Boser-Upp proposed that cultural differences in gender norms may result from different traditional cultivation methods. Shifting cultivation, where soil is dug up with a tool similar to a garden hoe, and women do most of the agricultural work. Plow cultivation is large animal pulls a plow and men tend to control the plow. Women tend not to participate in labor outside and instead focus on domestic matters. Children often stay with women due to dangers of being around plows and large animals that pull plows. A strong division of labor is thus established. Overall, cultures that rely primarily on plows are expected to be associated with more gender inequality. So kind of the idea here, this is a proposed theory, that because in order to survive particular divisions in labor, due to technologies needed to live within a particular culture, created differences in gender roles and variation within gender inequality. A group of scientists sought to empirically test Bowser-Upp's hypothesis. The question was, does historical plow use predict current attitudes toward gender roles? They compared cultures that primarily used plows during and before the 19th century versus those that did not. The results indicate that those that relied on plows before were currently still low on gender egalitarianism and had less female labor force participation. And the same was found in the United States with immigrants' cultures of origin as a predictor. This is evidence of persistence of culture. So kind of the idea here is that within a given culture, there are different technologies, there are different environments, and thus individuals have to interact with the environment in different ways to survive. And those ways that individuals in groups, interact with environments kind of persist over time. And what these researchers found, that there was a correlation between cultures that relied on plows and scores on gender egalitarianism. That is, that there are lower rates of gender egalitarianism in cultures that relied on plows, or I should say lower gender egalitarianism compared to cultures that did not have to rely on gender plows. Again, gender plows being wherein large animals are kind of pull the plow, and men tend to control the plow, and women are and young children are kept separately from those plows because of the dangers associated with the technology and possibly the large animals pulling them. Thus, kind of these strong gender roles and divisions of labors were established, and these researchers found that those cultural practices persisted over time in the form of lower gender egalitarianism in cultures that adopted these technological ways of gathering crops. Researchers have noted cultural differences in the level of self-consistency shown by participants. Cultures differ in motivation to be consistent across situations. In one study, participants were asked to sit in different contexts and describe themselves using the 20 statements test. Japanese participants varied in their self-descriptors depending on the context, while American participants responded similarly across context. So we're going to get into the implications of this momentarily, but kind of the idea here is that the Who I Am test was administered to two groups of individuals, that is American individuals and Japanese individuals, and thus, they were asked to describe themselves. And what the researchers did, they varied the environment in which individuals were asked to fill out that Who I Am 20 statements test. So in one condition, students were asked to fill out that Who I Am, that 20 statements test within a professor's office. And in another condition, they asked the student to fill out that 20 statement question test in the presence of a fellow student, and in another condition, they asked the students to fill out that test in a large group of individuals. So you got you have two groups, Japanese and American students, and you have three conditions. They fill out the test in a large group setting with a fellow student or in a professor's office. And what the researchers found was that individuals described themselves differently depending on the context in which they, depending on the environmental context that they were filling out the test. That is, depending on the condition that they were asked to fill in the test. But specifically, it was only the Japanese participants. They varied in their self-descriptors depended on the context, while the American participants responded similarly across contexts, which you can see in the kind of to your right in that table. So how can this difference be explained using the independent/interdependent views of self that were discussed earlier? The interdependent self is flexible across contexts, whereas the independent self is stable. What challenge does this pose for cross-cultural studies? This challenges a methodological assumption in personality studies that may have not considered the context in which participants took the personality measures. It is not clear which context provides more accurate results of true self-measurement. So this goes back to what I've discussed before in the previous slides. This idea in Western cultures that the personality of an individual is consistent. It's no matter where you are, what the circumstances are, whatever age you're at, your personality is the same. and it's going to be the same regardless. So thus you can measure individual's personality in any setting and expect to see no differences in the results. However, in this study, the results from this study, however, challenge this assumption, and thus kind of much of the field of personality, traditional, I should say, personality studies, with individuals from interdependent cultures varying in how they describe themselves, given depending on the environment in which they are filling out the test. And so then the question becomes, okay, what is the true self? And frankly, there's not a good answer to that. Where should you administer this test? In a laboratory setting, or among an individual's family members, or maybe among an individual's religious groups, or club, or political organization? It's difficult to say, to unpackage what is the true self, and how you go about measuring that self across cultures is a limitation to psychological studies right now. Another classic example from general psychology is cognitive dissonance theory, which is a distress feeling that arises from observing others behaving inconsistently. Cognitive dissonance theory proposes that we are motivated to be consistent. Observing our own inconsistency leads to distress. And self-consistency motivates us toward dissonance reduction, or attempts to resolve distress by changing behaviors to match our attitudes, or changing our attitudes to no longer appear inconsistent. Dissonance can arise, for example, after choosing between two equally desirable/similar alternatives. Such a choice leads to dissonance because features of the alternatives are inconsistent with our choice. To reduce dissonance, we rationalize by emphasizing positive features of our chosen alternative and negative features of the rejected alternative. Downplay negative features of our chosen alternative and positive features of rejected alternative. Generally, what is shown in traditional studies on cognitive dissonance. So as stated, the general idea of cognitive dissonance is that individuals have this natural, innate desire to be consistent. And in order to, or when there are inconsistencies that arise within an individual, this creates distress, and then we try and solve this dissonance through reduction techniques. And that is, we change our behaviors to match our attitudes, and change our attitudes to no longer appear inconsistent. And how that's kind of and another way that we do this is through rationalization. So say we select something, and we're kind of feeling distant about it. We don't like that the thing that we chose and that we thought was going to be great actually sucks. So we can emphasize the positive features of the thing that we chose and the negative features of the thing that we rejected. Or we can downplay the negative features of of what we chose, and the positive features of the rejected alternative. So you kind of basically have different approaches to rationalize the choice that you made, because you feel uncomfortable that the alternative that you chose, the features of the alternative that you chose are shitty. They're inconsistent with our choice. They're not good. And that makes us feel bad. So kind of the general idea here is that we have a need to feel consistent. We want our choices to represent kind of our attitudes towards something, and or our original desired reason why we chose that thing. And when our item ends up sucking, or when our behaviors are inconsistent with kind of our attitudes, we shift those things to match, or we rationalize the choices we make because we cannot handle this inconsistency. And this is generally known as cognitive dissonance, and the way we talk about it and what studies have traditionally shown in cognitive dissonance literature. Now let's talk about cultural variation in cognitive dissonance. People from different cultures may show dissonance reduction in different ways. Canadians rationalize their decisions after making a choice for themselves, while Japanese individuals did not. So Japanese rationalize their decisions after making a choice for someone else. East Asians are motivated to be consistent with others, while North Americans are motivated to strive for consistency within ourselves. So what we're seeing here is not the absence of cognitive dissonance, but rather differences in how that cognitive dissonance is used by a particular culture. And East Asian cultures, individuals experience kind of the dissonance through and are motivated by the need to be consistent with others, while North Americans are motivated to be consistent with themselves, and thus are want to rationalize their own decision making is because they want their choices to be consistent with the reason their choices to be consistent with the features of their choice. So again, going back to that previous example, when we find out that the phone that we bought actually sucks, we can rationalize. So say you brought an Android and you're like, oh, I don't really like, or the new Note or whatever, and you're like, oh, I really don't like that the headphone jack is different. So you can choose to emphasize on other important parts or good parts about your phone, or you can downplay the fact that you don't have a headphone jack anymore, and also downplay other alternative phones' positive features. So kind of just that need to rationalize your decision to make it more consistent with your original desires. And that Canadians demonstrated this. Well, Japanese do not. They rationalize their decisions after making a choice for someone else. That is, say that they bought the new Note for someone else, and they rationalize their decision based on that choice that they make for someone else. And that is consistent with the need for East Asians to be consistent with others, while North Americans need to and motivation to be consistent with themselves. And that should sound awfully familiar, like the interdependent and independent sense of self, wherein North Americans in this sample, but in cultures in particular that have independent sense of selves, having that strong, consistent, stable sense of self, while others in interdependent sense of selves who are more likely to have higher rates of collectivism, having that much more fluid sense of self and their sense of self being connected to and being more impacted by the relationships towards others within their in-group. Thus, kind of their cognitive dissonance being higher when making choices for other people as opposed to their own choices, which are only implicating choices for themselves. So there's their own individual choices that only impact them. And this, again, it kind of reflects the importance of relationships within an in-group and kind of the stress and the motivation they have to maintain those principles of an independent sense of self and collectivism more generally. Similar results are also found when reminding people of their past decisions. For people from the United States who have an independent sense of self, reminders of their own past behaviors compel them to act in accordance with past behaviors. People from Poland who have an interdependent sense of self, reminders of their friends' past behaviors compel them to act in accordance with their past behaviors. People with an interdependent view of self are motivated to be consistent with others, while people with an independent view of self are motivated to strive for consistency within themselves. So kind of the idea here is very similar to what we just talked about, this independent versus interdependent sense of self, and the ability of researchers to create cognitive dissonance by reminding an individual from a particular culture of previous behavior. And that previous behavior can be a behavior of that particular individual or their friend's behavior. And you see in independent sense of self cultures reminders of past behaviors that maybe conflict with current behaviors, create a cognitive dissonance within an individual within an individualized culture, or living in a culture with an independent sense of self values are more prominent, creating higher levels of cognitive dissonance, thus kind of shifting behaviors in response to that cognitive dissonance. And you can see this in the chart laid out here. Versus individuals in interdependent sense of self cultures, wherein reminders of past behaviors of their friends compel individuals within an interdependent sense of self culture to act in accordance with those past behaviors. So on the one hand, you have independent sense of self cultures having higher cognitive levels of cognitive dissonance by being reminded of their past behaviors, and thus an individual will change their behavior kind of to reflect their past behavior, versus a culture with an independent sense of self, creating more cognitive dissonance when a researcher reminds a individual about their friend's past behaviors, which compels them to act in accordance with the past behaviors of their friends. So we have cognitive dissonance in both cultures, but what is kind of creating that cognitive dissonance is different between two cultures, and particular independent versus interdependent sense of self cultures. Benefits of acting consistently across cultures. Su found that cultures differ in the benefits derived from self-consistency. Participants in this study were compared on self-consistency, that is, how similarly people viewed themselves in different situations. Participants also completed measures of subjective well-being, and two informants, a friend and a family member, were asked how socially skilled and likable they thought the participant was. Among participants from the United States, self-consistency had strong positive correlations with well-being, social skills, and likability. Among participants from South Korea, researchers found much smaller correlations on those measures. So kind of the idea here in that individuals who grew up in a Western culture, cultures that emphasize the independent sense of self, the idea is, okay, this person needs to be consistent, or otherwise, he's being flaky, he or she's being flaky, being two-faced, just being untrustworthy. Well, in cultures where self-consistency are less valued and are more reflective of an interdependent sense of self, self-consistency has much lower correlations with likability, social skills, and well-being. So again, kind of just empirical evidence that cultures not only have different views on the sense of self, but also different views on self-consistency, and also different views on the likability, the social skills, and the well-being, those the degree to which there are negative kind of connotations associated with individuals acting in a non-consistent way with Western cultures, in this particular study, the United States, finding a larger correlation between self-consistency and kind of like these likability traits versus Korean culture. Self-awareness. The self has two vantage points. The subjective self-awareness, which is just taking on the perspective of the subject, an I perspective that is focused on the outside world, not the self, and the objective self-awareness, which is experiencing the self as the object, a me perspective, that is focused inward and conscious of how others see and evaluate us. Self-awareness for the independent self. How does culture affect self-awareness? Well, individuals within an independent self-culture are less concerned with others' assessments of us. Kim et al. Found that conducted a study which showed that Americans' self-evaluations were relatively unaffected by whether they thought someone else had seen their score on a test. They evaluated themselves based on their own subjective standards, often as subjective self-awareness. In self-awareness for the independent self, individuals who live in cultures with that place a high value on independent or interdependent selves are more concerned with others' assessments of them. Hong Kong participants and self-evaluations were affected, i.e. amplified, by knowing what another person knew about their own performance, often have objective self-awareness. So basically what we're getting at here is that if you self-evaluations are affected by or more affected by someone else viewing their performance on a particular task in cultures with high levels of or interdependent sense of self cultures. So if a sample of Chinese individuals, if someone else viewed their performance and rated that their performance was done well, Chinese individuals are their self-evaluations would be more effective by that performance review. That is, if they thought if someone rated them as doing well, they would self-rate themselves as doing well, or to a much higher degree. While compared to the Americans in this sample, if an individual looked at their performance and kind of just said how they thought that they performed, the Americans sampled in this study were unaffected by that performance review. That is, their self-evaluations were unaffected by someone else viewing their performance. And this kind of gets back to this idea of an independent sense of self. The evaluation of others kind of don't matter as much. You have these sets of traits that are consistent no matter the circumstances. You know what those traits are. Americans typically have higher levels of subjective self-awareness as opposed to individuals in interdependent who have interdependent sense of selves have a kind of this objective self-awareness. Wherein they're focused on how other people evaluate them, because kind of going back to that whole foundational point of this is that the social relationships of your in-group matter. They define who you are. Your memberships define who you are. Your relationships with others define who you are at higher levels than individuals living in independent sets of self of cultures. And you can see this reflected where if a person gives you a performance review, Americans being far less affected by the performance review. They're going to rate themselves, if they think they're great at something, amazing, regardless of the review, while individuals in an interdependent culture will rate themselves, they'll self-evaluate themselves higher if they receive a positive view from an individual, particularly like within an in-group or a valued member of society. Implicit theories on the nature of the self. Implicit theories guide our interpretations of the world. Implicit means that theories are a set of beliefs that we take for granted and usually don't actively test. There are two implicit theories of the self. The incremental theory of self, which is a belief that abilities and traits are malleable and can change and improve, and the entity theory of self, which is believed that abilities and traits are largely fixed and resistant to change, reflecting innate features of the self. People with incremental theories respond differently to failure than people with entity theories. Incremental theories, people respond by redoubling efforts, focus on their efforts and the strategy used. People have trouble in school, take remedial courses if they have this theory of self. Entity theories, people respond by blaming their own innate lack of ability. There are cultural differences in theories of self. Incremental theories tend to be characteristics of people with an interdependent self, such as typically found in Asian cultures. Entity theories tend to be characteristics of people with the independent self, found in North American cultures. So this gets back to the fact that the self is kind of stable, and this is reflected in this entity theory of the self. So you have this independent sense of self, wherein everything is stable, you're consistent across all circumstances, but also this entity theory, this implicit entity theory, wherein you kind of have it or you don't. Your traits, your abilities, they're fixed. They're very difficult to change, if changeable at all, and they kind of reflect this innate sense of self. That's there's kind of really no reason to kind of redouble your effort and kind of like continue to try and push through. At lower compared to individuals with incremental theories, those interdependent sense of selves, where people respond by doubling their efforts. They focus on their efforts and the strategies they used, and this is because they believe that abilities and traits are malleable and can change and improve. And this kind of just gets back to the interdependent sense of self. You're much more malleable. You don't have that kind of schematically that bold line around you, wherein your traits are fixed. And like you're unable to be moved by relationships with others. And the interdependent sense of self, they understand that you are able to be who you are depends on the members within your in-group, and thus kind of your traits, your abilities are constantly fluctuating because your self is defined by at higher levels through members of your in-group. Thus, you should focus on certain efforts and strategies used when responding to failure, because things are not innate, they're not fixed, things are malleable. Thus, you can redouble your effort. It's worthwhile to do so, because what's the point of redoubling your effort if your abilities are innate and fixed? The English language has about 15 or 18,000 personality trait words. There's much overlap in words used to describe personality traits. Long lists of traits can be simplified by grouping correlated traits together. Factor analysis is a statistical method for identifying groups of things that are alike or different. It can be used to simplify a long list of items into a much shorter list of underlying factors by identifying patterns of correlations between the items. So basically, a quick way to understand factor analysis is you can look at all 18,000 personality trait words and then just do some type of statistical analysis on the words and see which words are kind of highly correlated together, which words cluster together. And then those highly correlated sets of words, those clusters of words, are thought to represent kind of this underlying factor that describes a particular cluster of words. So let's put this into a more concrete example in the next slide. Casa and McCrae argue that 5 personality traits underlie those traits. Factors underline those traits, as measured by the scale called the Revised Neuroticism, Extroversion, Openness Personality Inventory. This is called the 5-factor model of personality, aka the Big Five. So kind of the idea here, going back to the factor analysis example, is we have 18,000 words, we look at correlations between all the words, and then we kind of describe those particular correlations, those clusters of correlations. So individuals will look at, for example, words deal with extroversion, that is outgoing, social, and dominant, and they say, oh, look at all these words, they're all very similar, they're all highly correlated. Let's let us name this cluster extroversion, and that's basically how it works. You're just looking for sets of correlations, and then you name the correlations. And this is how the Big Five model of personality came about. And the acronym is OCEAN, with openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism being the 5 traits, 5 factors of personality, aka the Big Five. A Big Five study conducted across 50 different cultures revealed universality in the structure of 5 factors. This means that people in all 50 cultures organize themselves along the 5 factors. Personality also seems to mature similarly across cultures. People become more agreeable, more conscientious, and less neurotic with age. Some limitations to Big Five research is that the Big Five was created using English personality terms and mostly with Americans. They may not capture cultural-specific personality traits. Investigations in a number of cultures, including Spain, Greece, the Philippines, and China, have yielded additional factors. So the idea here is that although many cultures, in particular this study of 50 different cultures, found evidence of a structure of Big Five, that does not mean that those are the only personality traits found within those cultures. So, for example, one culture may have all 5 of the factors, traditionally associated with the Big Five, but also have 2 other factors that are found in their culture, but not others. And this could be related to the fact that the Big Five was used using English personality terms. So we look at the English 18,000 personality trait words, and then we conducted a factor analysis on them. And because that's our methodology for creating the Big Five, that's going to present certain limitations. And these limitations are evident in some studies. And we're going to review a couple of them. A factor analysis of Chinese traits found 4 sets of personality traits, so not a Big Five, but rather 4. They found the dependability, which is kind of like neuroticism, social potency, which was a little like extroversion, individualism, which was similar to agreeableness, and then interpersonal relatedness, which is focused on harmony, relational orientation, and tradition. These are somewhat correlated with the big 5-factor model personality, with dependability being correlated with neuroticism, social potency being correlated with extroversion, and individualism being correlated with agreeableness. relatedness. Interpersonal relatedness, however, is not related to any of the factors, and openness was not related to any Chinese personality factors. So what we have here is that 3 of the Chinese factors were correlated with American Big Five. However, there's a 4th factor that is not correlated with any of the American Big Five personality factors, and also the American personality factor, openness, was not found to be correlated with any of the Chinese Big Four personality traits. So we see similarities, but also cultural distinctions in personality traits within this study. So as I stated, studies have typically found some correlation among the Big Five with other cultures. However, when we tried to generalize to non-industrialized populations, the problems that we talked about of generalizability become larger within non-industrialized populations. So, for example, the Simane, for example, do not have the same personality structure in their vocabulary, and they seem to have only 2 personality factors, neither which maps onto any Big Five cultures. So we see here a culture that does not have any correlation, their personality trait factors having no correlation with American Big Five, and in fact only having 2 personality factors. And you kind of tend to see this as stated in these subsistence cultures, these non-industrialized populations, having far less correlations, their personality trait factors having being less correlated with the American Big Five than more industrialized cultures. And as you kind of get other industrialized countries, such as China, they have some correlation with American Big Five, but they also have their own culturally distinct personality factors that do not correlate with any American Big Five factors, and also an American Big Five factor, in particular, openness, was not correlated with any Chinese Big Four personality trait factors. So to wrap it up, there are cultural differences in motivation for self-consistency in how people view themselves, socially organize themselves, and describe themselves. While there is some evidence for universal personality factors, some cultures also appear to have cultural specific personality factors. And that's all for this week. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week.